Good evening. We're back. My dears, it's time for Tales and Cocktails. I'm sorry to have a bit of a minor accident. I inadvertently bit my lower lip and it swelled, and it made reading aloud pretty impossible. But there's no problem tonight, and so we can return to BRAT FARRAR. Part 8. On Wednesday morning, Bee took him to call on the tenants of the 3 farms, Frenchland, Upacres, and Wigsell. Excuse me. Gates last, just to learn him, Bee said. Gates was last also in importance, since Wigsell was the smallest of the 3 farms. It had originally been the home farm of Latchett's and lay just beyond the rectory on the slope north of the village. It was almost too small a farm to be self-supporting, but Gates opened twice a week and was not dependent on what he made from Wigsell. "Do you drive, Brat?" Bee asked as they prepared to get into the car. "Yes, but I'd rather you did. You know the road," he had almost said. "The car better." "Nice of you to call it a car. I expect you're used to a left-hand drive." "Yes." "I'm sorry it had to be the bug. It isn't often the car goes wrong on us. Jameson has it all its inside out on the garage floor and is conducting a post-mortem in a silent fury." "I like the bug. I came from the station in it yesterday." "So you did. What a very long time. It seemed like that to you." "Yes." It seemed years away to him. "Have you heard that we've been saved from the Clarion?" she asked, as they sped down the avenue to the accompaniment of the bug's sewing machine song. "No? Are you not a consumer of the press at breakfast?" asked Bee, who had breakfasted at 8 o'clock. "I never lived where we had papers to read at breakfast. We just switched on the radio." "Oh, Lord, yes. I forget that your generation doesn't have to read. How have we been saved by 3 people we never heard of and are never likely to meet? The 4th wife of a Manchester dentist, the husband of a principal boy, and the owner of a black leather trunk." She pressed the horn and turned slowly to the right out of the avenue. "The owner of the trunk left it at Charing Cross with someone's arms and legs in it. Of course, it may be the owner's arms and legs. That is a question which will occupy the Clarion for some time to come, I expect. The husband of the principal boy is suing for alienation of affection, and none of the 3 people, which is very nice for the Clarion. Since the reports of divorce cases have been pruned, the Clarion has been suffering from frustration, and a suit for alienation of affection is a gift from heaven, especially when it is Tatty Thacker's affections." She looked with pleasure at the morning. "I do like a morning after rain." "You still want to come?" "What?" "The 4th wife of the Manchester dentist." "Oh, yes. She, poor wretch, has just been exhumed from a very expensive and elaborate tomb and found to be loaded with arsenic. Her husband is found to be missing." "And you think that the Clarion will be too busy to bother about us?" "I'm sure all they want to do with Tatty. She had a whole page to herself this morning. If they ever bothered about the Ashbys, they would print the report in a tiny paragraph at the bottom of a page, and 5 million people would read it and not be able to tell you 2 minutes later what was in it. I think we're quite safe. The Westover Times will have one of their usual discreet paragraphs this morning, and that will be the end of the matter." Well, that was another snag out of the way. In the meantime, he must keep his wits because he was supposed to know these people. Frenchland was farmed by a tall, rosy old man and his tall, sallow sister. "Everyone was afraid of Miss Hassel," Loading had said. "She had a face like a witch and a tongue that took the skin off you. She didn't talk, just made one remark, and you found that you were raw. Well, this is an honor, old Mr. Hassel said, coming to be had with her. Mr. Patrick, I'm glad to see you. I'm tarnation glad to see you. He took Brat's hand in his gnarled old fist and closed on it with his other one. There was no doubt that he was glad to see Patrick Ashby again. It was difficult to know whether Miss Hassel was glad or not. She eyed Brat while she shook hands with him and said, "This is an unexpected pleasure." Her dry use of the conventional phrase and its wicked appropriateness amused Brat. "Foreign parts don't seem to have changed you much," she said. As she set out glasses and the crushed in one way, Brat said, "You have?" She wasn't going to gratify him by asking in what way. "I'm not frightened of you anymore." Old Mr. Hassel laughed. "You beat me there, son. She still puts the fear of God in me. If I'm half an hour late getting home from market, I creep up the lane with my tail down like I was a sheep stealer." Miss Hassel said nothing, but Brat thought there was a new interest in her glance. And she went away and fetched some shortbread from the kitchen, which she had obviously had no intention of producing before. They drank a liquid called white port wine type and discussed Rhode Island Reds. At Upacres, there was only plump Mrs. Dockett, and she was busy making butter in the dairy at the back. "Come in, whoever you are," she called. And they went down the cool tiled passage from the open front door and turned into the chill of the dairy. "I can't stop this," she said, looking. "Goodness, I didn't know. I just thought it was someone passing. The children are all at school and Carrie is out in the barn. Goodness, to think of it." Bea automatically took her place at the churn while she shook hands with Brat. "Well, well," said kind, plump Mrs. Dockett. "A fine, good-looking Ashby you are. You're more like Mr. Simon than ever you were." Brat thought that Bea looked up with interest when she said that. "It's a happy day for us all, Miss Ashby, isn't it? I could hardly believe it. I just said to Joe, I kind of thing that happens in books and in pictures and plays. Not the kind of thing that would happen to quiet folks like us in a quiet place like Clare," I said. "And yet here you are, and it's really happened. My, Mr. Patrick, it's nice to see you again, and looking so well and bonny." "Can I have a shot at that?" Brat asked, indicating the churn. "But of course you have," Mrs. Dockett said, looking taken aback. "You used to come in special on Saturday mornings to have a go at it." Brat's heart missed a beat. "Did I?" he said. "I've forgotten that." "Always say quite frankly that you don't remember," Loading had advised. "No one can deny that you don't remember, but they will certainly jump on you if you try to make believe about anything." "I thought you did this by electricity now," he heard Bea say, as she made way for him at the churn. "Oh, we do everything else by electricity, of course," Mrs. Dockett said, "but I can't believe it makes good butter than you'd get at the International in Westover. Sometimes when I'm rushed, I switch on the electricity, but I'm always sorry afterwards. Awful mechanical it is. No artfulness about it." They drank hot black tea and ate light, floury scones and discussed the children's schooling. "She's a darling, Mrs. Dockett," Bea said as they drove away. "I think she is still of the opinion in her heart of hearts that electricity is an invention of the devil." He must stop himself from volunteering remarks. It was not important about the churn, but it quite easily might have been something vital. He must be less forthcoming. About Friday, Brat, Bea said, as they made their way back to Claire and to Wigsell. What is on Friday? Brat said out of his absorption. Bea looked round and smiled at him. Your birthday, she said. Of course, a birthday. Had you forgotten that you were going to be 21 on Friday? She asked. I had, almost. He caught her sidelong look at him. After a pause, she said, You came of age a long time ago, didn't you? She said it without smiling, and it was not a question. About Friday, she went on, I thought that since we have postponed the celebrations for Uncle Charles's benefit, we wouldn't have a party on Friday, with she to sign. So we shall have him to lunch and make just a quiet family party. Papers to sign. Yes, he had known that there would be papers to sign sooner or later. He had even learned to make his capital letters the way Patrick did, thanks to an old exercise book that Loading had unearthed and filched from the rectory. And after all, signing a paper didn't make him any more of a heel than he was being at this moment. It just put him more surely in the law's reverence, made the thing irrevocable. Is that how you would like it? What? Oh, the birthday. Yes, of course. A celebration if it comes to that. Can't we just take this coming of age for granted? I don't think the neighborhood would be very pleased if we did. They are all looking forward to some kind of party. I think we shall have to give them one. Even the invitation cards are all ready. I altered the date to a fortnight after Charles's arrival. He is due in almost 23 days. So you'll have to thole it, as old Nanny used to say. Yes, he would have to thole it. Anyhow, he could sit back now and relax for a little. He was not supposed to know the Gates family. They were coming to the village now, the white rails of the south paddocks on their left. It was a washed and shining morning. The sky was metallic, and the light had a silver edge to it. As they passed the entrance to the rectory, Bea said, Alec Loading came down for the weekend not long ago. Oh, what is he doing now? Still playing roue parts in dreadful little comedies and farces. You know, 4 characters, 5 doors, and 1 bed. I didn't see him, but Nancy said he had improved. In what way? Oh, more interested in other people. Kindlier. He even made efforts to get on with George. Nancy thought age was beginning to tell. He was quite happy to sit for hours with a book in George's study when George was out. And when George was in, they would yarn quite happily. Nancy was delighted. She has always been fond of Alec, but she used to dread his visits. The country bored him, and George bored him even more, and he never bothered to hide it. So it was a pleasant change. Halfway through the village, they turned into the lane that led to Wigsell. You don't remember Emmy Vidler, do you? She asked Brat. When he had a farm the other side of Burrs. When her father died, Gates put a bailiff into his farm and took over Wigsell, and of course the butcher's shop. So they are very comfortably off. The boy couldn't stand his father and got himself a job in the Midlands somewhere, engineering. But the girl lives at home and is the apple of her father's eye. She went to an expensive boarding school where I understand she was known as Margot. Her name is Peggy. They swung into the farm entrance and came to rest on the small old cobbles of the yard. 2 dogs rushed at them in wild self-importance, yelling their arrival. I wish Gates would train his dogs, said Bea, whose dogs were as well trained as her horses. The clamor brought Mrs. Gates to the front door. She was a faded and subdued little woman who must once have been very pretty. "Glenn, Joy, be quiet," she called ineffectually, and came forward to greet them. But before she reached them, Gates came around the corner of the house and in a few strides had anticipated her. His pompous welcome drowned her more genuine pleasure, and she stood smiling gently at Brat while her husband trumpeted forth their satisfaction in seeing Patrick Ashby on their doorstep again. Gates was a large, coarse individual. He had had the youthful vigor and assurance that appealed to pretty, fragile little women like Emmy Vidler. "They tell me that you've been making money in horses over there," he said to Brat. "I've earned my living from them," Brat said. "You come and see what I've got in my stable." He began to lead the way to the back of the house. "But Harry, they must come in and sit down for a little," his wife protested. "They'll sit down presently. They'd much rather look at a piece of good horseflesh than at your gewgaws. Come along, Mr. Patrick. Come along, Miss Ashby. Alfred," he bellowed as they went down the yard, "turn out that new horse for Miss Ashby to see." Mrs. Gates, trailing along behind, found herself side by side with Brat. "I'm so happy about this," she said quietly. "I remember you when you were little, when I lived here in my father's day. Except for my own son, I've never been so fond of a small boy as I was of you." "Now then, Mr. Patrick, have a look at this here. Have a look at this. Tell me if that doesn't fill the eye for you." Gates swept his great limb of an arm at the stable door, where Alfred was leading out a brown horse that looked oddly out of place in the small farmyard, even in a region where every small farmer kept a mount that would carry him across country in the winter. There was something exceptional. "There, what do you think of that, eh? What do you think of that?" Bee, having looked, said, "But that surely is the horse that Dick Pope won the jumping on at the Bath show last year." "That's the horse," Gates said complacently. "And not only the jumping, the cup for the best riding horse in the show. Cost me a pretty penny, that did, but I can afford it, and nothing's too good for my girl. Oh, it's for Peggy I bought it. That wouldn't carry me." A shout of laughter. At least Brat supposed it was laughter. "But my girl now, she's a feather in the saddle. I don't have to tell you, Miss Ashby, you've seen her. There's no one in the county deserves a good horse better than my Peggy, and I don't grudge the money for it." "You've certainly got a good horse, Mr. Gates," Bee said, with an enthusiasm in her voice that surprised Brat. He looked across at her and wondered why she was looking so pleased. After all, this brown horse was a potential rival to Timber and all the other Latchet's animals. "Got a vet's certificate with it, I need hardly say. I don't buy pigs to show it this year." "Of course she is. Of course she is. What did I buy it for but for her to show?" Bee's face was positively blissful. "How nice," she said, and she sounded rapturous. "Do you like it, Miss Ashby?" Peggy Gates said, appearing at Brat's side. Peggy was a very pretty creature, pink and white and cold. Brat thought that if it were possible to cross Miss Parslow and Eleanor, the result would probably be Peggy Gates. She accepted her introduction to Brat with composure, but managed to convey the impression that it was personally delightful to her to have Patrick home again. Her small hand lay in his with a soft pressure that was intimate rather than heartily, and resisted a temptation to wipe his palm down his hip. She accepted Bee's congratulations on her possession of the horse, allowed a decent interval for further contemplation of it, and then, with an admirable display of social dexterity, lifted the whole family from the yard into the drawing room of the house. It was called the drawing room and was furnished as such, but Bee, who remembered it as old Mrs. Vidler's parlor, thought the watercolors and wisteria wallpaper a poor exchange for the luster jugs and framed engravings. They drank very good Madeira and talked about the Burrs agricultural show. And they drove home with Bee still looking as if someone had left her a fortune. She caught Brat's considering look at her and said, "Well, you look like a cat that has been given cream," he said. She gave him her sideways, amused glance. "Cream and fish and liver," she said, but did not tell him the truth. "When all the fuss of Friday is over, Brat," she said, "you must go up to town and get yourself a wardrobe. Walters will take weeks to make your evening things, and you'll need them for the celebration when Uncle Charles comes home." "What shall I get?" he asked, at a loss for the first time. "I should leave it to Walters if I were you." "Outfit for a young English gentleman," Brat said. And she looked sideways again, surprised by the twist. Eleanor came into the sitting room as Bee was opening the midday Post and said, "She bumped." Bee looked up hazily, her mind still on the contents of the mail. "She bumped, I tell you. For a whole 50 yards, she bumped like a good one." "The Parslow girl? Oh, congratulations, Nell, dear. I never thought I'd live to see this day. Is no one having sherry?" "Brat and I have drunk sufficient strange liquids this morning to last us for the rest of the week," Eleanor asked, pouring herself some sherry. "Not as badly as I'd been prepared for," Brat said, watching her thin, capable hand manipulating the glasses. That hand wouldn't lie soft and confidential and insinuating in one's own. "Did Dockett tell you how he got his wound?" "Dockett was at market," Bee said, "but we had hot buttered scones from Mrs. Dockett." Dear Mrs. Dockett. Bread. She wasn't going to give us that, but she succumbed to Brat's charms. So Bee had noticed that. "I'm not surprised," Eleanor said, looking at Brat over her glass. "And Wigsell? Do you remember that brown horse of Dick Pope's? The one he swept the board with at Bath last year?" "Certainly." "Gates has bought it for Peggy." Eleanor stopped sipping sherry and thought about this in silence for a moment or two. "For Peggy to show?" "Yes." "Well, well," said Eleanor slowly, and she looked amused and thoughtful. She looked at Bee, met Bee's glance, and looked away again. Went on sipping sherry. After an interval broken only by the rip of paper as Bee opened envelopes, she said, "I don't know that that was such a very good move." "No," said Bee, not looking up. "I'm going to wash. What is for lunch?" "Goulash. As made by our Mrs. Betts, that is just stew." The twins came in from lessons at the rectory and Simon from the stables, and they went in to lunch. Simon had come down so late to breakfast that Brat's only intercourse with him today had been to wish him good morning. He seemed amiable and relaxed and enjoyed the success of the morning. Bee provided an account with periodic confirmation from Brat. When she came to Wigsell, Eleanor interrupted her to say, "Did you know that Gates has bought Peggy a new horse?" "No," Simon said, looking up with mild interest. "He has bought her that brown horse of Dick Pope's." "Riding Light?" "Yes, Riding Light. She's going to show it this year." For the first time since she had met him, Brat saw Simon Ashby flush. He paused for a moment and then went on with his lunch. The flush died, and normal calm. Both Eleanor and Bea had avoided looking at him while he absorbed the news, but Ruth studied him with interest. And Brat, eating Mrs. Betsy's goulash, studied him with his mind. Simon Ashby was reputedly crazy about the Gates girl. Was he glad that the girl had been given a good horse? No, he was furious. And what was more, his womenfolk had known that he would be furious. They had known beforehand that he would find Peggy's entry as a rival unforgivable. They had, understandably, not wanted the Gates affair, yet recognized instantly, both of them, that Peggy's possession of riding light had saved them. What kind of creature was this Simon Ashby, who could not bear to be beaten by the girl he was in love with? He remembered Bea's inordinate pleasure in the brown horse. He saw again Eleanor's slow amusement at the news. They had known at once that that was the end of the Peggy affair. Gates had bought that horse to be upsides with latchets, to give his daughter a mount as good as any owned by the man he hoped she would marry. And all he had done was to destroy any chance that Peggy ever had of being mistress of latchets. Well, Simon was no longer master of latchets, so it would not matter to the Gates family horse. But what kind of heel was Simon that he could not love a rival? "What is Brat going to ride at the Burrs show?" he heard Eleanor say, and brought his attention back to the lunch table. "All of them," Simon said. And as Eleanor looked her question, "They're his horses." This was the kind of thing that the English did not say. Simon must be very angry to desert the habit of a lifetime. "I'm not going to show any horses, if that is what you mean," Brat said. "That requires technique, and I haven't got it." "But you used to be very good," Bea said. "That is a long time ago. I certainly don't want to show any horses in the ring at Burrs." "The show isn't for nearly 3 weeks yet," Eleanor said. "Bea could coach you for a day or two, and you'd be as good as ever." But Brat was not to be moved. It would have been fun to see what he could do against English horsemen. Fun especially to jump the Latchets' horses and perhaps win with them. But he was not going to make any public appearance as Patrick Ashby of Latchets if he could help it. "Brat could ride in the races," Ruth said. "The races they ever, couldn't he?" "Timber is not going to be knocked about in any country bumpkins race if I still have any say in the matter," Simon said, speaking into his plate. "He is going to Olympia, which is his proper place." "I agree," Brat said, and the atmosphere ceased to be tense. Jane wanted to know why fractions were vulgar, and Ruth wanted a new bicycle tire, and the conversation became the normal family conversation. Before lunch was over, the first of the visitors arrived, and the steady stream went on from after lunch and coffee through tea to 6 o'clock drinks. They had all come to inspect Brat, but he noticed that those who had known Patrick Ashby came with a genuine pleasure in welcoming him back. Each of them had some small memory, kept the memory green, because they had liked Pat Ashby and grieved for him. And Brat caught himself being gratified in an absurd and proprietorial way, as if some protege of his own was being praised. The light that had been set on Simon this morning made him more than ever Patrick's champion. It was all wrong that Latchet should have been Simon's all those years. It was Patrick's inheritance, and it was all wrong that Patrick should not be here to inherit it. Patrick was all right. Patrick would not have gone sick with rage because his best girl had a better horse than he had. Patrick was all right. So he accepted the small verbal gifts on Patrick's behalf and was pleased and gratified. Time when teacups were being mixed up with cocktail glasses, the local doctor appeared, and Brat ceased to be gratified and became interested in Eleanor's reactions to the doctor. Eleanor seemed to like the doctor very much, and Brat, knowing nothing whatever about him, was straightway convinced that he was not good enough for her. The only guests left now were Colonel Smollett, the chief constable for the county, the two Mrs. Burns, friend of the village, and according to B, had their walls hung with plates and warming pans and other kitchen utensils, and Dr. Spence. Dr. Spence was young and red-haired and bony, and he had freckles and a friendly manner. He was the successor of the old country doctor who had brought the whole Ashby family up, and he was, so B confided in an interval of tea pouring, much too brilliant to stay in a country practice. Brat wondered if he stayed for Eleanor's sake. He seemed to like Eleanor very much. "You caused us a lot of trouble, young man," Colonel Smollett had said, greeting him, and Brat, after the polite evasions he had experienced so far, just as his notions of English middle class had been derived from American films, so his idea of a colonel had been derived from the English press and was equally erroneous. Colonel Smollett was a small, thin man with a beaked nose and a self-effacing manner. What one noticed about him was his extraordinary neatness and his gay blue eyes. The colonel gave the Mrs. Burns a lift in his car, but the doctor lingered. That he pulled himself together and went. "Poor Dr. Spence," B said at dinner. "I'm sorry he wouldn't stay. I'm sure that landlady of his starves him." "Nonsense," said Simon, who had recovered his good temper and been very bright all the afternoon. "That lean, red-haired type always look underfed. Besides, he wouldn't have eaten anyway. All he wants is to sit and look at Eleanor," which confirmed Brat's worst fears. But all Eleanor said was, "Don't be absurd," and she said it without heat and without ink. They were all tired by dinner time, and it was a quiet meal. The excitement of having Brat there had died into acceptance, and they no longer treated him as a newcomer. Even the unforthcoming Jane had stopped accusing him with her eyes. He was part of the landscape. It was wonderfully restful to be part of the landscape again. He was hungry. But as he got ready for bed, he puzzled over the problem of Simon. Simon, who was quite sure that he was not Patrick, but had no intention of saying so. Why? Because he would not be believed, and his protest would be put down to resentment at his brother's return? Because he had plans for a dramatic unveiling? Because he had some better way of dealing with an impostor who would not be unveiled? Simon, who was so good a dissembler that he could fool his own family about his inmost feelings. Simon, who was so self-centered, so vain, that to come between him and the sun was to insult him. Simon, who had charm enough for 10 ability. Simon, who was like timber. He stood again at the open window in the dark, looking at the curve of the down against the sky. Perhaps because he was less tired tonight, he was no longer so afraid, but the incalculable factor in this life that he was due to lead was still Simon. If Simon so resented Peggy Gates's owning a better horse than his, it would have been his reaction to Patrick's sudden succession to Latches. He considered this a long time, staring into the dark. And as he turned at last to put the light on, a voice in his mind said, I wonder where Simon was when Patrick went over the cliff. But he noticed the heinousness of this at once, of course. What was he suggesting? Murder? In latches? 13? He was letting his antipathy to Simon run away with his common sense. The suicide of Patrick Ashby had been a police affair, an affair of inquest and evidence. The thing had been investigated, and the police had been satisfied that it was, in truth, suicide. Satisfied? Or just without a case? Where would that coroner's report be now? In the police records, he supposed. And it was not easy for a civilian to persuade the police to satisfy an idle curiosity. They were busy people. But the thing must have been reported in the local press. It must have been a local sensation. There would be an account of that inquest, and he, BRAT FARRAR, would unearth it at the first opportunity. Antipathy or no antipathy, common sense or no common sense, he wanted to know where Simon Ashby was when his twin went over the Westover cliffs. Mr. Sandal was to come on Thursday night and stay over till after luncheon on Friday. On Thursday morning, Bea said that she was going into Westover to do some special shopping for Mr. Sandal's meals, and what would Brat like to do with his day? Brat said that he would like to come with her and see Westover again, and Bea looked pleased. "We can stop on the way through the village," she said. "It will be one less for you to meet after church on Sunday." So they stopped at the newsagent's, and Bea was exhibited, and Mrs. Gloom sucked the last ounce of satisfaction out of the drama of his return, and they laughed together about her as they sped away to the sea. "People who can't sing are horribly frustrated," Bea said after a little. Brat considered this non sequitur. "The highest mountain in Britain is Ben Nevis," he said, proffering one in his turn. Bea laughed at that and said, "No, I just meant that I should like to sing at the top of my voice, but I can only croak." "Can you sing?" "No, I croak too. We could croak together." "I doubt if it is legal. One never knows nowadays. And anyhow, there is that." She waved her hand at a large sign which read, "Motorists, please refrain from using your horn. This is a hospital." Brat glanced up at the building set on the slope above the town and remarked that it was uncommonly pretty for a hospital. Yes, much less horrifying and terrifying than the normal place. It is a great pity that that was allowed to happen. She jerked her chin at the row of cheap shops on the opposite side of the road, some of them not much better than shacks. Dingy cafes, a cobbler's, a bicycle depot, a seller of wreaths and crosses, a rival seller, and anonymous businesses with windows painted halfway up and odd bills tucked in the windows. They were running down the slope into the town, and this miscellaneous strip of roadside commerce was the last petering out of the poorer suburbs. Beyond was Westover proper, clean and neat and shining in the reflected light from the sea. As Bea turned into the car park, she said, "You don't want to tail around looking at seafood for Mrs. Sandal's, and we'll meet for lunch at the Angel about 1:15. He was some distance away when she called him back. "I forgot to ask if you were short of money. I can lend you some." "Oh, no, thanks. I still have some of what Cosset Thring and what you may call them advanced me." He went first to the harbor to see the place that he was supposed to have set out from 8 years ago. It was filled with coastwide shipping and fishing boats. He leaned against the warm stones of the breakwater and contemplated it. It was here that Alec Loading had sat painting his old scow on the last day of Pat Ashby's life. It was over those cliffs away to the right that Pat Ashby had fallen to his death. He pushed himself off the breakwater and went to look for the office of the Westover Times. It took him some time to find it because, although every citizen of Westover read the local paper, very few of them had occasion to see it. Its home was a stone's throw from the harbor, in a small old house in a small old street, which still had its original cobbles. The entrance was so low that Brat instinctively ducked his head as he went in. Beyond, after the bright sunlight outside, there was blackness. But out of the blackness, the unmistakable adolescent voice of an office boy said, "Yes?" Brat said he would like to see Mr. McCallan. The voice said that Mr. McCallan was out. Find him. "The fourth table on the left, upstairs at the Bluebird." That's explicit. Can't help it. That's where he is. That's where he always is this time of day. The Bluebird, it seemed, was a coffee shop round the corner on the harbor front, and Mr. McCallan was indeed sitting at the fourth table on the left upstairs, which was the one by the far window. Mr. McCallan was sitting with a half-drunk cup of coffee in front of him, glowering down on the bright front. He greeted Brat amiably, however, as one old friend to another, and pulled out a chair for him. Brat said, "The only way I'll ever get myself on the front page of the Clarion is in a trunk," Mr. McCallan said. A trunk? In sections? And I can't help feeling that would be a wee bit drastic. He spread out that morning's Clarion so that the shrieking black print streamed up from the table. The trunk murder was still front-page news after 3 days, it having been discovered that the legs in the case belonged to two different persons, a complication which put the present case hors concours in the trunk murder class. What's horrible is not that it happens, but it happens to your Aunt Agnes, if you follow me. "Hi, miss, a cup of coffee from a friend here. Brother Johnny goes to the war and gets killed, and it is all very sad, but no one is shocked, civilization being what it is. But if someone bumps Aunt Agnes off on her way home one night, that is a shock. That sort of thing doesn't happen to people you know. It must be worse when someone you know bumps off someone's Aunt Agnes." "Aye," said Mr. McCallan, shooting an extra coffee and stirring it vigorously. "I've seen some of that. Families, you know. It's always the same. They just can't believe it. Their Johnny. That is the horror in murder, the domesticity of it." He took out his cigarette case and offered it. "And how do you like being Claire's white-headed boy? Are you glad to be back?" "You can't imagine how glad. After that fine, free life in Arizona or Texas or wherever it was. You mean you actually prefer this?" Mr. McCallan jerked his head at the Westover front, filled with placid shoppers. And as Brat nodded, "Mercy be here. I can hardly credit it." "Why? Don't you like the place?" Walking about in their southern English sunshine and metaphorically spat. "They're so satisfied with themselves. I can't take my eyes off them," he said. "Satisfied with their lot, you mean? Why not? Nothing in this world came out of satisfaction, except the human race," said Brat. Mr. McCallan grinned. "I'll allow you that." But he went on glowering down at the bright harbor scene. "I look at them and think, these people kept Scotland fighting for 400 years, and I can't find the answer." The answer, of course, is that they didn't. "No? Let me tell you that my country 1,000 years keeping the shores of England. But for them, your Scotland would be part of Spain today." This was apparently a new idea to Mr. McCallan. he decided to let it ride. You weren't looking for me, were you, when you came to the Bluebird? Yes, I went to the office first and they told me you would be here. There's something I want and I thought that you might help me to it. Not publicity, I take it, Mr. McAllen said dryly. No? Man, who doesn't? You're a privileged person, Mr. Ashby, a very privileged person. I suppose the Westover Times keeps back numbers. Oh, yes, back to June the 18th, 1827. Or is it June the 28th? I forget. So you want to look at the files. Well, there's not much, but you'll find it very interesting, of course. One's own death must be a fascinating subject to read about. You've read about it, then? Oh, yes. Before I went out to Latchett's on Tuesday, I naturally looked you up. So it was that when they stumbled down the dark stairs to the cellar, Mr. McAllen was able to put his hand on the required copy without delay and without raising the dust of 150 years about their ears. I'll leave you to it, Mr. McAllen said, spreading the volume open under the naked light above the old-fashioned sloping desk. Have a good time. If there's anything else I can do for you, just let me know, and drop in when you feel like it. He trotted up the stone stairs, and the scuffling sound of his shoes faded upwards. He was left alone with the past. And next week we'll see what he reads about the death of Patrick Ashby. My dears, thank you for joining me. That is part 8 of BRAT FARRAR by Josephine Tey. And next week we will get on with part 9. It just gets richer and richer, it really does. So I hope to see you again next week. Meanwhile, thank you so much for being with me. And have a lovely evening and have a lovely, lovely holiday. If it's Christmas, whatever your holiday is, celebrate happily and with the people you love. Thank you so much, my dears. Good night.